Please welcome your moderator for the next conversation, Noel Tichy.
Thank you. Delighted to have the pleasure and opportunity of orchestrating this gang up here of colleagues. But before we do, we started this whole effort with most of you already giving input on a survey ahead of time. And I want to just take a couple of moments to review some of the input on what is it going to take, because this session is on what is it going to take to lead in the role of presidency. And here are some of your responses. So if we could start with the next presidency. The first and kind of overwhelming commitment that, or people said is important, is building a high-performing team and delegate effectively. And as you can see, 67% of you said that was the most important thing. And then there was a cluster of items that really were about working effectively in a team, having the openness and the willingness to get input and creativity in government. And then one that I Warren Bennis and I are pretty keen on, which is judgment. At the end of the day, one of the most important things a leader does is make judgments. And then, obviously, setting a long-term strategic agenda, being able to prioritize policy opportunities. 58% of you said that is really important. Then lower down, interestingly enough, was the kind of the team, building productive relationships with Congress, 50%, recruit talented advisors and staff, 50%. And finally, which I found a bit surprising, the lowest one was mobilize public sentiment through compelling vision, personal conviction, skillful use of the media. But let's just use this as a backdrop to a conversation we're going to have from a different variety of lenses up here on what is it going to take to be a leader. And Fred Greenstein, as you will note from his background, has long been a student, kind of a political psychologist on political leaders. And we want Fred to start off giving his point of view and some context, and then we'll pick up from each of our panel members their perspective and their lens on leadership. So,
Fred. Well, many of you are probably sitting on my knowledge in that I brought a one-page handout with me, and I noticed that it was put on the seats, but I don't see it on anyone's laps. So what I'm providing is an instant Reader's Digest glimpse at the logic and, to some extent, the specific content of a book I published in its first edition in 2000 and its second edition in 2004, entitled The Presidential Difference, and in its second edition subtitled Leadership Styles from FDR to George W. Bush. And this is a book which has a more condensed version of something like the set of questions that many of us responded to on email, and that I haven't actually seen the spreadsheet because of the angle of where I'm sitting and where the screen is. But in this particular book, I look, having steeped myself over many years in the background that might give me a sense of what made FDR, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, JFK, and on through the 12 of what are sometimes called the modern presidents, the presidents of the electronic communication era and of the time when government mushrooms and the United States becomes a world power and the presidency becomes physically augmented through the executive office of the president and what's now called the OMB. And had the good fortune to talk to people like a number in this room, Roger Porter, Dave Gergen, about their presidential experiences. Late in this project, I stitched it together by using a kind of simple job description of the qualities that one finds in presidents and other leaders, not just in effective presidents, but the qualities that are also illuminating for identifying things that might lead people to fall short of what you would hope of for an effective chief executive. The chapter titles of this book, which suggests something about the particular interpretive thrust of each chapter, are specific to the presidents, but at the bottom of the handout is a list of 6 qualities, and I'll simply review these and make some references to what has been instructive about presidents from FDR on. The presidency, and I would say this goes back to George Washington. In fact, I've just finished a book that looks at the presidents from George Washington to Andrew Jackson. It's a teaching and preaching and communicating role, and the end of the last panel was full of discussion of what presidents can or can't succeed in communicating and how they communicate. In the modern period, the presidents who are exemplary from the standpoint of public communication certainly include FDR, JFK, who's of course an interesting model if we were to see an Obama presidency, someone who learned to become hyper fluent in reaching the public, and then the professional communicator, who was one of the people who both Roger and David worked for, who'd been in 50 movies and many other public communication statuses, and that was Ronald Reagan. Public communication is obvious as you come out of a campaign. It's sort of the outer face of presidential leadership. The inner face is knowing how to structure your presidency, to make choices that are going to work, and to produce a team, but not a groupthink team in which people brainwash one or another, and you fail to get the appropriate give and take that will lead you to do things like not factor the Secretary of State out of the decision on whether to go into Iraq. It doesn't at least fit the standard notion of how you make best use of your subordinates. So how will a new president communicate? That's particularly inscrutable when you have people coming in who, no matter who, whether he or she or the Republican candidate, who've been Senate members and have not had executive experience. Well, a second pair of more or less matched attributes you might look for in a leader are the political savvy. Do you have the political smarts not to, say, attempt a major reform of the health care system, which is going to self-destruct for a variety of reasons, including being inadequate consultation within the political system, choice of a lightning rod figure as a person to lead that thrust, and so on. And even if you have a lot of skill, as a Lyndon Johnson does, are you sophisticated enough about policy? And we saw how mind-numbing the demands on sophistication are for the next president, from the panorama of listed points in the first panel. Do you have a policy direction, and if so, is it one that won't? Because without a policy direction, you'll go hither and yon and not concentrate your energies or take advantage of the initial honeymoon period, if there is one. And if you have one, is it one that won't self-destruct? And finally, as much as we would like to see gods or demigods in the Oval Office at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We have human beings. The first panel suggested that there are considerable cognitive requirements just to understand MX versus so-and-so. But the fact that we can have a Rhodes Scholar serve in the White House and do things that are or something that is so cognitively faulty as to take up in a sexual relationship with a neurotic teenager or early post-teenager suggests that there's something that may trump cognitive intelligence, and that's what's come to be called emotional intelligence, your ability to muster your emotions and put it together. And for that, among the modern presidents, I think the really striking case is Richard Nixon, who really was phenomenally acute. His aide, Bryce Harlow, once described Richard Nixon as an ambulatory computer, and Nixon even published an article in Foreign Affairs stipulating what a series of almost visionary, improbably visionary policy goals: establish effective relations with the People's Republic of China, find a modus vivendi and a way of handling the question of nuclear arms with the Soviets, and he entitled the article After Vietnam, implying that we couldn't keep 500,000 American troops in Vietnam, which is what he inherited. He was overwhelmingly reelected, having made significant steps in all of those directions, but he had simultaneously done these nefarious, dark, impeachment worthy activities, taped them so that they could be eventually revealed, and now he's listed in these, I think, not very constructive lists of great presidents and poor presidents, way down on the bottom, despite his extraordinary accomplishments. So this is a kind of you might think of this as a sort of distillation of the kinds of separate points that were on that spreadsheet, and the downsides as well as the upsides of what presidents have done are informed, I think, by looking through my particular template. But and if you actually want to buy the book, my grandchildren get the royalties.
Thank you very much, Fred. I think that's a nice context for now looking forward at what we need to ask ourselves are the requirements for leadership going forward as we move into this election. And next, I'm going to have Rosabeth Moss Kanter make her comments. One of the things I said to the panel, I don't know whether it'll work, but we're going to try it, is we really want to create more of a conversation both among the panel and the group in general, given this context. So I've asked each of the panel members at the beginning of their remarks to reflect on the person just before them, and if there's a point where they really feel aligned and in agreement, kind of highlight it, and then flip the coin over. Is there a point of dialogue, difference in anything you heard? But at least it'll force all of us to listen to our colleagues rather than sit there preparing our monologues, which sometimes happens on panels. But one of the things I just want to point out before I turn it over to Rosabeth, who's been a great friend and colleague since the early 70s, and some of us go back to then, Rosabeth. And Men and Women of the Corporation book was a very well-known bestseller. But if you follow Rosabeth's career, she's always kind of looking over the horizon at what's next. I think her dissertation actually was on communes. Very few people know that. So she's been a student of organization, leadership, in a lot of different forms, and her latest work really looks at kind of the issues of nation building and the topic of today. So it would be helpful if you could link back to Fred's comments, and then let's hear your point of view, Rosabeth.
Thank you, Noel. Well, first of all, I certainly support that list of traits: communication skills, team building, getting the right people in office, don't do stupid things, use your emotional intelligence and not just your cognitive intelligence. But I just want to shift for a moment from traits and attributes to the tasks. And I won't, well, one of my favorite management philosophers, Woody Allen, once wrote an all-purpose commencement speech that I was reminded of in listening to the last panel, particularly Graham Allison. I loved Larry Summers' optimism. Graham Allison reminded me of this speech in which Woody Allen said, "As never before in human history, humanity faces a crossroads. One path leads to despair and utter hopelessness. The other path leads to total oblivion. Let us pray that we have the wisdom to choose the right one." Unfortunately, that seems to be the national mood today. And as Joe Klein said, with about 80% of the American public thinking we're heading in the wrong direction, I can only use the analogy from my own book in a few years ago, Confidence, which is America's on a losing streak. That is, we're caught in a variety of vicious cycles heading downward, and therefore what we need is a turnaround leader. We need a leader who understands the nature of the problem and knows how to turn it around. And there are three key aspects of that task, and I think some of that will pick up on Fred's points and things said in the first panel and what I know my distinguished colleagues here will say. I mean, three main challenges if you look at the difference between a losing streak and a winning streak, or a downward spiral, and that building of momentum that Larry Summers said is so important because people want to see progress. They don't necessarily believe you'll solve a problem overnight, but they want to see you're in the right direction. So the first has to do with accountability. In a losing streak, denial reigns, anger and blame. There's always an enemy. It's always somebody else's fault. Truth is not on the table. The facts are withheld. Spin and ideology is what prevails. And so we need a leader who does more than just tell the truth, who puts facts on the table, and if those facts are complex, first of all, knows how to hold complex thoughts in a single sentence, doesn't oversimplify, brings more people into the discussion, and that doesn't mean necessarily a national dialogue, although we've been talking about a national conversation on race. Nelson Mandela created a new constitution for South Africa as the first democratically elected president by involving the whole country in the equivalent of town meetings and being able to weigh in through surveys, websites. We now have the tools in which we could, in fact, have national dialogues, but I simply mean a larger number of people at the table rather than closed inner circles making the decisions, getting where there are disagreements about the facts, having that aired in an open way so the rationale is clear. Instead of talking about enemies, we need to have more nuanced understanding of what the problems are. They're never single factors, whether it's a particular trade agreement, good or bad. It's never single factors, and therefore more facts on the table, more accountability, more openness. That would also make people respect government a little bit more, because right now it looks like government is not picking the people who are necessarily having the broadest points of view. That would help attract the best and the brightest, and that's what turnaround leaders do first. You got to face what the situation is. The second thing, and I'm talking fast to stay within the time, is collaboration. In a losing streak, there is infighting, fragmentation. Even, by the way, since it sounds like I'm using a sports analogy, even on very small losing sports teams, everybody's fighting with one another. And also, in losing situations, everybody starts turning to a few superstars who are going to have all the answers, and everyone else goes passive. When you truly build a team, it is building on the strengths that exist as well as compensating for the weaknesses and including everybody. So inclusiveness is an incredibly important attribute of a turnaround leader, that they not only know how to build their small team around them, they do know how to reach out across partisan divides and bring people together. And that means in more sophisticated ways than we have currently. Bifurcated thinking is the enemy of change. In fact, that is a characteristic of downward spirals. Us, them, you're with me or you're against me. In fact, I think instead leaders need to invoke what I've come to call the change agent rule of thirds, which is in any situation there's a third, or shall we say at least one group for you, one group against you, and a group in the middle that stands on the fence waiting to see where it goes that can be converted. You know, it wasn't thirds when it came to the war in Iraq. It was more like 5% of the world with us, 90% of the world against us. Well, whatever. You get the point. That if it's only for or against, as opposed to the vast group that can be brought into the discussion, you'll always lose. You'll always turn some people against. As President Clinton said once, that the way you deal with terrorists or enemies, for example, is you acknowledge there are those against us that you have to take action on, but you isolate them. Meanwhile, you shore up your allies, you find out who's for you, and for that vast group in the middle, you start doing something for them that shows you have their interests at heart. That might be very small actions. It turns out in Afghanistan, when women were convened to talk about what their agenda would be for a future of Afghanistan, and everyone thought, you know, it's going to be big issues, education, health, etc., they wanted the garbage picked up. Because picking up the garbage, cleaning out the streets, actually affected health and it affected quality of life. And all over the world, we can be identifying what it is that that group of people at the grassroots, like your tables, it's a wonderful symbolism. You all have grassroots on your tables. It's the people at the grassroots who are not necessarily sure, and we don't necessarily have to make them sophisticated policy analysts, but we do need to show them that we want to act in their interest, and let's not assume they're against us until we invest in them, and therefore more nuanced thinking with a collaborative spirit inside the country, inside Washington, but also to the world. And my third aspect of a losing streak that we need to turn into a winning streak, it has to do with initiative. In a losing streak, you start to see what has begun to happen in this country, but some of the presidential campaigns have actually awakened a new spirit by mobilizing new people to come out and vote. In a losing streak, people go passive. People feel helpless. If you think about what we heard on the first panel, I sat there saying, gee, I'm supposed to be a problem solver who actually does contribute to policy in presidential elections, going back with Larry to Michael Dukakis here in Massachusetts, where, by the way, when I was asked what office would you want if he became president, I said Ambassador Martha's Vineyard. But what happens when you listen to that litany of problems that seem so overwhelming, which is what goes on in a losing streak, people go passive. There's a psychological phenomena called learned helplessness, where you begin to feel like the Woody Allen story, whichever way you jump, you're going to get punished. That only makes it worse, of course, because then everybody, that creates demagoguery, because everybody is willing to give their allegiance to the first person with a plausible ideological explanation for why the enemy is doing that to us, to me, whoever the enemy is. That's why I don't like divisive populist rhetoric in this presidential campaign either. So what a turnaround leader does is they rebuild initiative toward innovation. There are in America right now models that are solutions to every single problem we face. For every problem we have, somebody somewhere, some social entrepreneur, some educational entrepreneur, some intelligent startup alternative energy company has a potential solution. First of all, leaders have to believe in the power of the grassroots, find those solutions, make them models, help scale them up. They believe in the power of the people, their inventiveness, their imagination, and call. We talked in the first panel about calling for sacrifice. That's the wrong word. I definitely believe we have to deal with the inequality problems. We shouldn't be calling for sacrifice. That again sounds like go home, close your doors, and give something up. We should be calling for involvement, for contribution. And that's what some of the great presidents did. We invoked John F. Kennedy, ask only what you can do for your country. We need to take national service to the next level. We need to get people involved in seeing that they can do something, however small. This is how companies turn around too. Ideas at the grassroots, however small they seem, those small wins sometimes become big wins, but it gives people efficacy and the belief that they can make a difference, and that will restore the confidence in of Americans that we can solve these problems of the world, because they have to be solvable unless we give in to the other problem in America right now, which is governing by fear, but also a belief in apocalyptic thinking, where we're at an end game and it's the end of the world anyway. If we don't want to get mired in apocalyptic thinking, then we've got to get moving, and we have to have a president that tackles those three issues of accountability, collaboration, and initiative on the part of the citizens. It's not all up to them in Washington. It's also up to us. We need to be empowered at the grassroots to get things done.
Thank you, Rosabeth. All right, Patrick Lencioni is next. And Patrick, again, you have got a nice little springboard from Rosabeth's comments, given that we're moving into teamwork and kind of what you've dedicated a lot of your life and career to. But I'd like you to ask you to start off with just reacting just quickly to Rosabeth's comments and then move into yours.
Well, two things. First of all, I'm going to be very boring compared to her, I'm afraid. So, and that accountability and collaboration are certainly at the heart of what any leader needs to do who builds strong teams. Now, the one thing I do want to say, though, is, and one of the reasons why I'm going to be boring is because when I talk about teamwork, I'm not going to be talking about dealing with Congress or the United Nations, because that is not teamwork. That is diplomacy and negotiation, and we're going to have others talk about that. When I talk about teamwork, and it's a critical trait for a leader, a president, I'm talking about leading small groups of people who have common goals and who are mutually accountable to one another for achieving those. And probably what I'm talking about here is the president's executive office of the president, which is not a kitchen cabinet, but that small group of people that they consider to be their advisors, whether it's the communications and press secretary or their chief of staff, might or might not be a vice president, policy advisors, legal advisors, that small group of people that gets together on a regular basis to get things done. And the task facing a president, I cannot imagine any CEO, I work with CEOs and leaders in sports and military and academia, I cannot imagine a longer list of things that they have to take on. And so their ability to take a small group of people and accomplish a great deal in a short period of time is probably greater than any other job I can imagine. And I was glad to see that team building was listed as the highest trait that people thought that a president must have. And so how do we go about figuring out who would be best at doing this? Now, unfortunately, we don't get to see that in a campaign, because most of what a leader does in building and running a team is done behind the scenes. So we don't get to see it in a speech or out on the stump or even in the Rose Garden. We have to know what they're doing behind closed doors, sitting at a table with their trusted advisors. So David can probably tell us more about this, and others who have worked behind closed doors. Here's the things I think we need to look for. I think experience is important. I want to know that a person has, in some setting in their life, done something meaningful in terms of building a team. In terms of, and that's not usually a committee or a task force, but it's really about having responsibility for running an organization, utilizing a group of people that they consider to be their primary team. And there's lots of different ways to get that. I will say this, in the world of politics, the Senate is not the best place for that. And that's why I think oftentimes we don't have a lot of senators who become president. And this time we have a choice of 3, it looks like right now. So that's an interesting, so you got to look deeper into their background. And I want to know, what have they done to run real organizations with real budget and real results, whether it's financial or otherwise. Now, beyond the experience, what qualities am I going to look for in a leader that's going to build a great team? The first thing I'm going to look for is humility, or what I call vulnerability. The willingness and ability of a leader behind closed doors with their team to admit when they don't know something, to acknowledge when somebody on their team has a better idea than they do, to apologize when they've made an error, and to ask for help. Now, this is not something, again, we fake in a speech. And it's very tempting for leaders to want to fake vulnerability. What I'm saying is this: behind closed doors, can they look at someone and say, teach me more about this, or I have no idea what I'm doing here, I need your help? Because groupthink, as people have said before, is often, I think, founded in ego, which I'll talk about in a second. So vulnerability and humility, because that's what builds trust on a team. People do not trust leaders that they work for that have no capability of being vulnerable or humble. Now, that is important because it enables us to avoid the next problem on a team, and that is the fear of conflict. I want to know that my president, my CEO, my Boy Scout troop leader, my soccer coach, I'm the soccer coach actually, so that's me, behind the scenes can tolerate and invite conflict with his or her team. Because when I know that there's a team that doesn't argue behind the scenes, that is not passionate in their deliberation with one another, I know that they're leaving goodness on the table and bad decisions can be made. So it's that trust that comes from humility which enables us to get conflict. Okay? You need to know that people on your team are willing to look you in the eye, no matter if you're the President of the United States or the 5th grade teacher, and say, I don't think that's the right thing to do. Okay? Now, the next quality I look for in a leader is someone who, and this is the most lacking quality we find in most CEOs and senior executives, and I'm guessing it's true in politics as well, that can hold their team members accountable not only for the results of their actions, but for their behaviors. And when you're the President of the United States or the CEO, we're talking about peers. We're talking about people that may be older than you, that are probably smarter than you in at least their area of functionality. And you have to be able to turn to them and say, I don't like the way you're doing that. Now, when a leader can't do that, we find that they usually fire people without having communicated, and that breaks down a team. I want to know that a president can turn to somebody and say, the way you're dealing with your staff on this is not going to work, or the way you're talking to the media has got to stop. And if a leader can't do that with their peers, that's going to break down the team. And the final quality I'm going to look for gets to ego. And that is, I want someone who has a distaste for ego and an obsession with results. Now, unfortunately, what I wrote down when I was listening to Rosabeth Moss Kanter is that I've always felt, since I was a little kid, that the best president would be someone who probably didn't necessarily want to be the president. And that we would go recruit them and ask them to serve. And that very possibly, someone who really aspires to be the president might not be capable of having such a distaste for ego. And while that's maybe wishful thinking, what I'm looking for is someone who, you know, Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, says, it's okay for a CEO to have charisma as long as he or she realizes what a disadvantage he's at. And so I think when it comes to building a team, charisma and the ego that can go with it can be a great detriment. So those are the things I look for in a leader. Humility to build trust, appreciation for good conflict among the team, willingness to hold people accountable for doing what's best for the team, and then obsession with results, not ego. And I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to Barbara Kellerman, who will ask you to make a link to Patrick's comments. But I think we'll add a very interesting, first of all, has played a key role on why events like this happen, because you've been in a leadership role and belongs to this organization, which has done some terrific stuff. And I think this event is an example of how timely this organization has been on topics like this. But I would like to point out that one dimension we haven't talked about is followership, which is her, I think, most recent book, and I assume part of what we'll hear from you is where that plays a role in all this. But first of all, maybe a couple comments on Patrick.
Well, thank you, Noel and Patrick and Rosabeth. It's, you know, I'm bold enough or daring enough to say that everything that has preceded me this morning falls under my umbrella. It's really true. As I am biting the hand that feeds me because I've been a leadership person for 25 years and counting. But the more I got into leadership, the more it began to dawn on me that we are badly neglecting the other side of the equation, which is followership. Now, I could go on and on about that, but I will suffice it to say that my comments, and really it refers to so many of the things even that came up in the first panel, including the impossibility of governing, the frustrations we feel. And I have to say that the last 7 years, I'm trying to be nonpartisan, but the gap now between the American president and the American people and the rest of the world, the disgusting, depressing decline in trust, that is an issue, guess what, of followership, of paying attention to those various constituencies, and the best way to think of these constituencies or followers is in a set of concentric circles. So the immediate constituency or set of followers would be your immediate team of advisors. So the conversation, though, doesn't particularly change when you're going out in these concentric circles. Nowadays, by the way, the concentric circles include the world at large. We've been talking primarily about the American political context, but in this day of technology impinging on every single thing that impacts on relations between leaders and led, the American president is being watched as never before. And not only by other leaders, but by activists, participants, followers in different countries that are emboldened as they have never been before to take on their leaders. And I could give you example after example, but I won't take the time to do that. Let me briefly, and Noel, you're going to have to give me a bit of a cue here with the 8 minutes, although I, like my predecessors, will talk fast. I want to set this contemporaneous discussion, at least briefly, in an historical context. It has always been difficult to lead within the United States. I'm now talking about leadership in America, not leadership worldwide. One of my predecessors this morning cited Alexander Hamilton. This was Roger Porter. And he talked about Hamilton, who did feel strongly about a strong executive. But much more to the point of our conversation, and much more to the point about the difficulties of presidential leadership, is this quote from the Federalist Papers, which shows how incredibly careful the founders were to make certain the executive would not have too much of an opportunity to lead. And the comparison filters all the way through because it's always to the King of Great Britain. The President of the United States, this is trying to sell the Constitution, would be liable to be impeached, tried, and upon conviction of treason, bribery, could be in effect dismissed. The person of the King of Great Britain, on the other hand, is sacred and inviolable. There is no constitutional tribunal to which he is amenable. So the contrast was made from the very start between a leader who can really lead, do what he wants, command and control, and a leader who has to earn it. Now, there's one other colleague of mine that I want to cite in this general regard, and that is a man by the name of Samuel Huntington, who wrote what I consider a fabulously pertinent point to relations between leaders and followers in the American political context. He talked about the American creed. Dissect these words, if you will, and then you tell me how easy it would be to lead in a context, in a political culture in which these words dominated: equality, liberty, individualism, constitutionalism, and democracy. To quote Huntington, in sum, the distinctive aspect of the American creed is its anti-government, anti-authority character. Opposition to power. You try leading when opposition to power is how everybody's thinking, and suspicion of government as the most dangerous embodiment of power are the central themes of American political thought. Okay. What is to be done, as Lenin said, 1903? What is to be done? He talked about making a revolution. I'm not talking about making a revolution. I am talking, though, about how do you lead in a political culture which has been so anti-leadership since its inception. One, and I'm going to end with a few questions. I think this is supposed to be some questions, job interview questions. The candidate or the president, one has to be aware, intellectually, cognitively aware of the importance of political skill in terms of leading in an environment which is so dominantly anti-leadership. So they have to be aware of the importance. You can't be too introverted. You can't lock yourself in the Oval Office and know what you're doing. You can't just be in there with a few trusted advisors. You've got to be aware of the importance of political skill, and you have to be willing, ready, and able to use it. What are some of the tactics and requisites of political skill? Timing, bargaining, arm twisting, compromise, personal appeals, personal access, ingratiation, education, mobilization, inspiration. I could go on, but you get the point. You have to be willing, if you're going to lead as a president in this impossibly difficult context, you have to be aware of the interpersonal tools, hypothetically at least, at your disposal. What can we say about the president's followers at whatever level of the concentric circle that we're talking about? Number one, they have always mattered more than we generally give them credit for. We are fixated on the president. Just watch MSNBC, for example. We're fixated on the president just as we're fixated on leaders generally, and that is a misunderstanding of what really happens. Because of changes in the political culture and in the culture more generally, and I'm particularly talking about what happened in the 1960s, all those revolutions, if you will, from the bottom up, followers are more important now than they have ever been before. In addition, because of the all-important, and I hinted at this a moment ago, still wildly underappreciated impact of technology on relations between leaders and followers, followers are becoming more, I didn't see that. Can you hold it up? 1 minute? You're kidding. That's a joke, right? Okay, not a joke. Followers are becoming more important than ever before. Let me simply say in conclusion, but it's not really a conclusion, presidents must demonstrate an understanding of the importance of their relationship to those whom they are leading, again in concentric circles. Here are some job interview questions, since I believe that's how we're supposed to end today, that I would ask a presidential candidate. And I'm going to give you only a handful out of about 7 that I've prepared. 1, how does your understanding of the importance of followers, remember, from teams to leaders across the world, of your constituents manifest itself? 2, do you make distinctions among your various followers? If no, why not? And if yes, what are those distinctions? Who do you think of your followers, your constituents? How do you engage them? How do you propose to inspire them? How do you propose to mobilize them? And finally, although again, not finally, what in your view are the most important skills so far as engaging your followers, your constituents are concerned? I'm done for now.
Thank you, Barbara. We're going to go to Max Bazerman, and you can see from his bio has a very distinguished career and specializes, one of his areas is negotiation. And if you want a role that's going to have to deal a lot with negotiation, let's look at a president's role. But before you start, maybe you could make a few comments on Barbara, and then let's hear from you, Max.
Happy to. To begin with, my experience is almost the opposite of Barbara's, because she subsumed all the other talks under hers, and I would say I came with a detailed presentation on a couple of minor points I wanted to make, and I've been taking notes, and I'm going to give an entirely different talk, because I find that all these so many comments that I've heard this morning highlight the relevance of the small points that I want to make. And one of those is on followership. And among the people who you need to have follow you are people on the other side who don't necessarily agree with you. David introduced the session by talking about how do we govern, and how does the next leader govern. Joe Klein talked about changing what they're leading to do, from getting elected to making wise judgments in the country's best interest moving forward. And that's what I'm really interested in. We've heard many comments about how to improve collaboration. And I want to talk about one goal of why we want to collaborate to begin with. And I think we want to collaborate to make wiser decisions. And so often, making wiser decisions occurs by being willing to make small sacrifices for larger gains. Okay? So sort of a key aspect of what we teach business executives is how to think clearly about wise trade-offs. And wise trade-offs often incur often a short-term sacrifice for a larger long-term gain. And that may sound obvious, but I brought a quiz for you. I am a professor, so I brought a quiz. So I'm going to give you two options, and I'd like you to listen to the two options, and you can think about which one you like better. If you die in an accident, your heart can be used to save another person's life. In addition, if you ever need a heart transplant, there's a 90% chance that you will get the heart. Option B, if you die in an accident, you will be buried with your heart in your body. In addition, if you ever need a heart transplant, there's a 45% chance that you'll get the heart. Now, I find this an easy one. I pick A, the vast majority of the world picks A, and our country picks B. Okay? And the solution to move to the wiser choice is we simply change the organ donation system from an opt-out system rather than an opt-in system. Right now, you needed to decide to opt in to the donation system rather than having the default be that you are in while still allowing you to opt out. And there are many European countries that are well above the 90% figure by making a relatively minor change. Now, is there a sacrifice? Yes, there's a sacrifice, but there's a far larger gain that we get. And I would argue that our nation is filled with these opportunities of low-hanging fruit that wise government should be able to go after. Dick Thaler and Cass Sunstein have a new great book out called Nudge about their libertarian paternalism strategy of how to create defaults that still give people unlimited options but lead to wiser decisions. And Thaler has demonstrated how this can be used to improve retirement strategies to a dramatic degree. We want a leader who captures those insights and creates systems around them to create wiser trades. But it does require some sacrifice. And what I liked about Joe Klein's comment is the reason we want to sacrifice is because the gains are going to be larger than the sacrifices. Okay? And I think that that's an absolutely critical point. But oftentimes, we need to deal with people on the other side. And prior to the current administration, we had some interesting systems in place. In the land preservation world, we had something called habitat conservation plans led by Bruce Babbitt, where landowners could get exemptions from the Endangered Species Act, but in order to get these exemptions from the letter of the law, they had to create a plan that created overall net improvement for the environment and for economic interests. I think that there are dozens of opportunities in government where we can make very wise trades between two seemingly disparate elements, but we failed to do that. Within EPA, we had Project XL that had similar properties. I think something on the opposite side is Sarbanes-Oxley, where people talk about is it too little or too much? And I would argue it simply missed wise trades. It was a bureaucratic nightmare that's imposing costs on corporations, not because it's too much regulation, it's not even the right regulation. We didn't come up with the wise trades when we were putting together that piece of legislation. So we want to create a mentality of when we interact with the other side, the people who we want to follow our leadership, who aren't necessarily in sync with our views, that when we go back and forth across the negotiation table, we're creating value rather than destroying value in the process. Too often, we do exactly the opposite. Okay? We take small gains in return for large losses because of the role of special interest groups and how that destroys the negotiation that needs to occur in Washington. I want to close by telling you a vivid episode when I was I'm going to make that. When I was around the table with 12 senior colleagues at the Harvard Business School. And the question under discussion is, what skills and competencies would we like our MBA students to have? And my colleague to my right, who you'll notice can have interesting things to say on a variety of topics, her response to this was, I would like our MBA students to have the skills and competencies so that before they invade a country, they have already thought about what they will do next. And And what I'm calling for through Wise Trades is a leader who has a vision into the future, who thinks multiple steps ahead, who creates wise trades not based on what feels good now and what can pass now, but what actually creates value for the current as well as future generations in terms of a wide variety of important policy decisions. So thank you all the folks whose comments I built on earlier.
Okay, thank you, Max. Let me set the stage for Bill George, who some of you may think is a professor and author at Harvard, but if you go back, as I have in his career, I think I first met him when he was executive at Honeywell. But I learned a lot more about Bill George. He obviously retired as CEO of Medtronic and had an incredible run there as CEO. But when Warren Bennis and I were interviewing him on our book on judgment, we went back, and I think this is relevant to this session. If you look at his bio that you have, he actually served in the U.S. Department of Defense when McNamara was Secretary of Defense, as a young man. But he had some very interesting observations from having been inside in that role, been in CEO roles, and now joining us in the ranks of the professors. But Bill, I'd like to kind of turn it over to you and maybe give you the same challenge. Is there something you can build off of what Max just said, and then let's hear your comments.
Well, thank you, Noel. And I'm going to offer a very different point of view than I think the general gist of things. I'll give you a little example. I went into, with all due diligence, to go in and complete the questionnaire that we were given and the 23 competencies. And as typical of me, I don't spend a lot of time reading the instructions. So I went through and honestly filled out the questionnaire. And when I got to submit it to the computer wouldn't take it because I had 23 competencies on my list. So it would only take 8. My point of saying that is I think you require all these competencies. But the reality is that leadership is not about competencies. It's not about experience. It's not about style. And it's not about leadership skills. We need all of those things. No one has all of them. And, of course, the key there is surrounding yourself with people who do. Max is talking about negotiation and getting to win-win solutions. I'm a huge believer in that, and I think you do it through collaboration. But I confess in my business life, I'm not a great negotiator because I'm too eager to get to yes. And so I need someone alongside of me who can be the hard-nosed negotiator to go through 58 points because I'm too quick to get to the final point and the end conclusion. And I think we all need to surround ourselves with people that are very wise. I think, what is leadership then about? And all my studies suggest it's about the authenticity and character of the leader. And if you think about qualities like judgment, like courage, like integrity, like authenticity, these are not competencies. You can't send someone out, one of my students, and say, go have courage. This comes from the essential character of the individual. And I think that's what you should be looking at in these candidates. If they're driven by anger or a sense of deprivation or a need for adulation of the masses because they feel an emptiness inside, when it comes to the test, they're not going to perform well. Arguably, Richard Nixon had the finest resume of anyone to become President of the United States. But he failed, probably more than any president's ever failed, because he lacked the internal, if you will, sense of who he was and authenticity. And I think that really brought him down. And I think that authenticity requires a high level of self-awareness, knowing who you are, and, as several others have mentioned, being willing to admit your mistakes. This is very hard to do. Can you show vulnerability? I often get asked when I give speeches, presumably on business leaders and why we need authentic business leaders, the question is, could we have an authentic leader in the White House? And until recently, I would always say, I don't know, with a nod to probably not, the media won't let us because they're going to tear apart someone's weaknesses or admitted mistakes. You recall in the presidential campaign of 2004 when George Bush was asked had he ever made a mistake, he said he actually couldn't think of one. And I think this is because of fear of will the public accept me as who I am? We all make mistakes, and I think part of it is acknowledging to ourselves that we have these weaknesses. How else, Pat, can we surround ourselves with a strong team until we acknowledge we don't have these skills and capabilities? So I think it's much more about an internal suggestion, as you did, willingness to be vulnerable, at least to those close to you, and to surround yourself with people who can shore up your weak suits. Now, I'll give you an example that Noel suggested. When I left Harvard Business School and graduated at the ripe age of 23 in 1966, nobly with 11 colleagues went down to the Department of Defense to work under Robert McNamara and supposedly supporting the war. And within about 60 days, all of us realized the great flaws in this war. But what I saw there, and David Halberstam wrote about this, the best and the brightest people, and they were extraordinarily bright people. They all thought very much alike. They all had very similar experiences, and they all took the country off the cliff together. In other words, they all marched off the cliff together. And so, again, it's not about just brilliance and experience. It's being willing to say we're wrong. And I watched in a building of 40,000 people, how many people spent their time trying to cover up the Secretary of Defense's mistakes. And something could never be admitted. So we're all running around being asked to do this. And I think that led to a huge tragedy. I have a colleague who was sitting in the back of the room. When I'd get gunned up and trying to overcome my mistakes, he would say to me, "Bill, you know what you do when you find yourself in a hole? Rule number one is stop digging." But all too often in politics, we dig ourselves into a deeper hole by not acknowledging the first mistake, and in international relations as well. So I'd much rather see a president who can acknowledge who they are and can be vulnerable and can have passed those values tests, but comes from an intrinsically strong place because they've dealt with their crucibles in life, they've dealt with their difficult times, and they really know who they are at a deep level. Now, I think, fortunately, the two leading candidates, one in each party, appear to be those kind of people that are quite authentic, and I think we may just actually have potential for a debate on the issues. Wouldn't that be wonderful if we could do that? But I'd like to suggest, finally, something about power, because I think we've written so much about the powerful leader, and we look at power as like a pie to be distributed. If I give my power to you, I've given some away. So we need to maintain power over other nations, over other people, over other parties, and I think that's a flawed notion. I think what we need in a president is someone who's self-confident enough to be empowering to other people. And I don't talk about followers in my book because I don't believe in leaders and followers. I believe much more in empowering other people, and then empowerment comes more a quality that's more like love. It's infinitely expandable because you can empower people. We need someone we all have our best side and our worst side. We need a leader who calls to our best side to empower us to step up and lead across the country, and frankly is willing to collaborate with other nations and people in other countries to get solution to these great global problems like energy and the environment, education, healthcare, not one of which can be solved strictly by the United States. We do need to say nothing of global peace and global poverty. These require collaborations. And I think if we can bring people together around an empowering sense of leadership with a very authentic leader, then I think this nation will be far better off.
Thank you, Bill. We're going to move to engage the audience on this, and I just wanted to add one other dimension to our conversation. One of the people who is not here because he's not able to travel right now so well is Warren Bennis, but I want to bring his voice here. Warren and I did a editorial in the Wall Street Journal in November on the presidential election based on a book we just finished on leadership judgment. We basically said, between us, what's missing in the leadership dialogue is any serious wrestling with the issue of what leaders do around making three kinds of judgments. People, who's on the team, off the team, strategy, what mountain do we climb, and when there's a crisis. And we said, no matter whether you're a president, a general, CEO of a company, Joel Klein running the New York City school system, those are the three most important judgments you make. And so we went out on a journey of spending a lot of time with leaders like Bill George, asking him, how did you make some of those judgments? And so we tackled in an editorial, not that we had any answers, but we raised some questions on the presidential selection And Warren, being the historian that he always comes up with interesting quotes, found a Ted Sorensen quote where he said, "I cannot emphasize how important that elusive quality is, far more important than organization, structure, procedures, and machineries. These are all important, yes, but nothing compared to judgment." And I just wanted to add the lens to our dialogue here of what we're really making our individual judgment in as voters is how well the leaders we put in place are going to make the judgments around who they surround themselves with, how they deal with the complex strategic issues, which the first panel clearly framed, from economic to geopolitical to educational, healthcare. And then we all know that as leaders they're going to face crises. How well equipped are they to handle those? So I wanted to add that lens, and my assignment was to also go back to Bill George, and I think without that authenticity, without character and courage as the foundation, none of this other stuff matters as far as I'm concerned. And I think that's another kind of discussion we need to have as we look at the next leader who's going to lead this nation. But let me now turn it to some more active dialogue, and Rod Kramer is going to lead off with some comments. Rod's a professor at Stanford Business School, and certainly done a tremendous amount of work on leadership. And Rod, I'd turn the microphone over to you, and let's engage this gang up here.
Oh, thank you very much, and it's great to be here. When Donna and David invited me to be a first respondent at this panel, I was very excited and happy to say yes. I always say yes to things because I find good things happen when I say yes to David and Donna. But then I realized I actually had no idea what a first responder is. The letter was very formal and it was capitalized, first responder. So like a lot of academics, I decided to do what I do when I have some sort of conceptual uncertainty in my life, and I Googled first responder. And here's what Google says a first responder is. The first responder shall be, and notice the use of the biblical imperative, shall be responsible for the administration of CPR and other essential medical interventions, shall be responsible for stabilizing the scene, and shall be responsible for coordinating the activity of subsequently arriving medical and emergency personnel. So I was very flattered, David and Donna, to be asked to do this. And should anyone need CPR or stabilization, I'm happy to provide that. And then there was a second definition that was a little bit more modest, which is to offer first commentary. So I have a feeling that was the role that you wanted me to take. And I study the presidency primarily from the perspective of studying presidential decision-making as a social psychologist and how presidents form judgment. I have the advantage of studying dead presidents, which actually makes it much easier because no one ever talks back to you. So I've studied primarily John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson's decision-making, and it's been a lot of fun. In terms of getting a conversation going in this room, the question I wanted to pose to the panel is a question I've been very interested in, and that is, how do you nurture and support the capacity of a leader to change his or her mind, to flip-flop, as we more derisively sometimes put it, because increasingly this seems to be, in an unstable, changing world, something leaders have to do.
I think Bill's ready to jump in.
Yeah, sorry to mention that. I think that quality is extremely important. Max Dupre once said the first job of a leader is to define reality, and I really do think it is to define the reality. We heard a lot of that in the debate in the first panel. What is reality, and then to adapt to it. The reality of Iraq is we won the war but lost the follow-on. And you have to define what is the new reality, because that reality is constantly shifting in all fields that we're having to deal with. And I think the capacity of leaders we want can do that. But that gets back then, you have to be willing to say the route I was going was the wrong way. And I have to make a deviation. Maybe it's 90 degrees, maybe it's 10 degrees. And then bring people with you, because this is a very large, diverse nation, and bringing 300 million people with you is not so easy. But I do think leaders need to have the wisdom, and this is a quality of wisdom, to find reality, and then the matter of the heart, which is to have the courage to adapt to it.
Rosabeth?
Yes.
great question, and I noticed that several of the panelists did talk about the importance of leaders being able to say those 3 little words, "I was wrong." I once coined a law of the universe, I call it Cantor's law, I don't know if anybody else does, that everything looks like a failure in the middle. You know, in just about anything we undertake, especially very complex endeavors, there are always going to be deviations from plan, shall we say. That's why, by the way, principles are so much more important than the details of proposals, because we know that they will change along the way. And without the flexibility to be able to redirect, to explain to people that the principle is still in place, the vision's still there, but we have to do it differently, then we get caught in traps of rigidity that don't allow us to get the results that our other panelists also talked about are so important. Now, so Bill George talked eloquently about some of the things a leader finds inside himself or herself that makes it possible to be able to say I was wrong or redirect. There's also a context, so I certainly agree with that. Character matters a great deal. There's also a context. It's a lot easier for leaders to do that when everything around them looks successful than it is when an admission of one weakness is going to call everything else into question. So that means that leaders and all the rest of us have to load as many situations for success as possible in order to make it possible to back down when something isn't going well. But it would be a very high expectation, even for the leader of greatest character, to be able to admit vulnerability or a mistake during a time when everything else is falling apart, because they're going to lose their job. So maybe we need leaders who don't need the job.
Okay, well then we'll move back down.
I've noticed a lot of abstractions and very few instances that have been brought up of episodes that might illustrate things that were done either well or poorly by presidents. But you referred to an interest you have in Kennedy and Johnson, and you raised the question of saying I was wrong. Well, Kennedy could scarcely have failed to acknowledge that he was wrong when, within the first 100 days of his presidency, they launched the disastrous Bay of Pigs, and even the very early memoir literature was full of things about just what a downer that was, and how he said various things about how frustrating it was actually to be president rather than to campaign for president. But he did say he was wrong, and whether it was humility or whatnot, I think it was a survival impulse and some acuteness and a rather unusual detachment that Kennedy had that led him to say, what can I do about this? Now, he didn't go to what had worked very well for his predecessor, Eisenhower, namely a more structured decision-making process in which all the diverse options were forced to the forefront so that they were argued intensively and well defended. That was not quite in his mode. But as an acute politician, he rejuggled certain things. He brought McGeorge Bundy into the White House rather than leaving him next door in the old executive office building. More important, he put his two closest aides, Ted Sorensen and Robert Kennedy, in on all decision-making, particularly foreign policy decision-making, and put them in the role of mandatory naysayer, where they would look for the worst possible outcomes. And I think it's generally conceded that this paid off in the episode that Graham Allison established himself for writing about, although actually Allison's book doesn't discuss in detail what Kennedy did, and that is to insist that everybody debate, to run the debates as long as possible, and to then finally recognize that the buck stopped with him. And they're the quality that Noel and Warren have written about, namely judgment weighed in. His aides were evenly divided over whether to have an immediate airstrike, which in the very plausible worst case, which has now been supported by post-Cold War evidence, probably would have led to an escalating nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union and perhaps the end of life on the planet, or to look for some option that might lead to negotiation or face saving. And this turned out to be the what in effect was a blockade against Soviet shipping and a rather delicate communication process, which Sorensen now writes about in his new and very fascinating memoir. But this was an example of a president earning his keep, and I think looking at actual episodes in the history of the presidency, perhaps going back to the very early presidents, is one way to lend some concreteness to the issues that we're discussing here.
Max has, I think.
First of all, the first responder who asked the question is probably one of the world's leading experts for answering it. So if we don't get it right, I hope that you'll embellish on the answers to your question. For me, the strange part of the question is what the leader needs to do is to admit that they pay attention to new information as it comes in. Now, that shouldn't be so hard, except I think that we have evidence not only do we tend to escalate to a previous course of action, or what Bill George referred to as to keep digging, there's also evidence that people don't like people who change their minds. Okay, and as a result, the flip-flopper routine has become a very well-used political tool. I want to throw out an idea that I've never talked to David Gergen about, but maybe draw him into this conversation. For me, when I think about how do you prepare for that episode where you are going to change your mind, I think that the answer to that is when you're not in the middle of the episode where people will hold it against you well in advance. You basically make it clear that I'm going to make the best decisions for this country I possibly can. And that means sometimes I'm going to make decisions, I'm going to get new information, I'm going to learn, and the decision is going to change. And for me, the challenge, and the reason I mentioned David Gergen is that he can figure out the answer to this far better than I can, is how do you communicate to the public before you even know what the specific episode is, that over the next 4 years, there are going to be decisions where new information is going to change the decision calculus, and as a result, I'm going to update that process. And I think that that's, for me, the key, because otherwise you have this constituency who thinks that you're admitting to being a bad decision maker when you're not. What you're admitting to is paying attention to new information as it comes in under uncertainty.
And at the risk of sounding like we all have to get a word in on this, I think that one thing I want to say is I think the key is not, because it's really important to understand the difference between waffling and changing your mind. Because it's so easy to criticize a president, but that's a tough differentiation and a critical one. I think for the American public, at least for me, I want to know why. Because there's the more information, and then there's the popular pressure. And I think that people get accused and criticized for changing their mind when they feel like, oh, this is not a popular decision now. I'm going to do it for poll numbers, and this is something that's been more, in the last 2 decades, more common. So I think that the question is, are you changing your mind because you think you're unpopular, or are you changing your mind because you really have better information? And I think the American public is far more understanding of someone changing their mind because they said, wow, we know things we didn't know before, versus I just got my latest poll results, and that we have no time for. And I think that's a critical difference.
I think that they should be. I'm not sure that they are.
Yeah.
I just want to say I don't think you can say I was wrong or change your mind too often. We hold it up here as an ideal, how wonderful to say I was wrong, how wonderful to apologize, but you can do so if you're a leader, especially if you're the President of the United States, only really sparingly.
I want to just jump in and ask Fred a question. Fred, on the being the historian here, one of the things I would just wrestling with here is judgment and experience. And you go back to Lincoln, and because we were commenting on people who are senators don't have much experience, and and maybe that's not a good example, but when we look historically, we didn't have a lot of data on some presidents who did some pretty good judgment when they were in as leaders. Maybe you can shed some light on that.
Well, there is historic good luck and historic bad luck, and if we looked at resumes, Lincoln would not be the obvious person, but he wasn't chosen by a resume. He was chosen out of the political process, which is full of contingencies and specifics. This was the point where the party system fell apart, where there were essentially four entities. He was a minority president. If you look at his life history, as it's been wonderfully reconstructed in David Donnell's large but compellingly readable book, you see a guy who, coming out of the most meager of backgrounds, somehow became an individual of great depth and subtlety and folk wisdom, who had acquired literacy not as a child, but bit by bit in fragmentary ways, but had absorbed the rhythms and content of the Bible and Pilgrim's Progress and Blackstone and so on. And there are stories about how when he traveled with other lawyers, people listened to him as he told anecdotes. He had this extraordinary sense of humor. So he was full of qualities. Doris Kearns Goodwin's Team of Rivals book brings out the way in which he could handle these far more august individuals. So, one of his qualities does seem to have been judgment, just as, Kennedy perhaps had a different kind of judgment in the missile crisis. He was a very bright guy who actually read books, and not in a systematic way that mere professors read them, but he'd say, I've got a trip to take, buy me a good work of history to read. And he'd been reading Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August about the net of misperceptions that led to the onset of World War I. And his brother in this posthumous memoir quotes him as saying, well, I don't want future historians, if there are any, to write about the missiles of October. He made the right decision, and I think it certainly wasn't based on polls, but much of this stuff is not based on polls. No one in the public even knew that he'd reconstituted his inner decision group, but it was something that was a sign of effective leadership.
David, do you want to? Okay, we got time for two more, I guess. Go ahead. Microphone over there.
Good afternoon. My name is Elisa Bassnight. I'm a corporate attorney in New York, former military officer, and I'm proud to say I was a Zuckerman Fellow last year. It's great to have all of the wonderful comments that you shared with us this morning. My question goes to, we haven't really talked about it, is the role of the Vice President. And so many excellent comments about leadership. We've talked about all of the pressing issues from a strategic standpoint in our earlier session and the characters and competencies this session. Given who we're seeing right now as the two front runners on both the Republican and Democratic side, would be curious to see if looking at the character of a vice presidential candidate, whether we should be focusing on how this person's going to help balance the ticket, or whether we should be thinking long term, and how, if we can do a combination, what characters we should be looking at for the vice presidency. Thanks.
I think you should call on Dick Cheney and that's a slip of the tongue. I think you should call on Dave Gergen to present his CNN persona. Actually, Dick Cheney is the last case of a vice president who was chosen despite his lack of electoral appeal, because he was thought of as such a bright and acute and perceptive Washington insider. And how that's performed, Mr. Card maybe will tell in his memoirs. But Dave, what is
David,
what are
you're going to...
I thought you were recommending David Gergen to be vice president.
On the question of vice presidency, I think that more than anything else this year, people are looking for someone who has the stature, weight, and wisdom to be president. That other kind of considerations pale in comparison. That if it's an Obama ticket, you need someone like a Sam Nunn, in my judgment, to give some weight and anchor to that. And if it's someone, if John McCain, I think given his age, it's especially important that he have someone who's prepared to step in and provide that kind of leadership. But I'd like to go back to let me respond to something Fred Greenstein said, and then I want to ask a question of the panel. Fred reminded us of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I love showing as a leadership film to the students here 13 Days. I think many of you have probably seen that film, but it's a wonderful film about decision making. And I'll just relate to you that a couple of years ago I showed that film to students here and then asked them to write a paper about John Kennedy and his leadership. And one young man wrote a paper back praising John Kennedy for the quality of the team that he created. And he said how especially impressed he was that John Kennedy had appointed to his team Kevin Costner. I've always wondered how to grade that paper. It was it was very difficult, but it did remind me that I saw Lewis Blair the other day. He was the legendary figure of, as you know, of the Truman's Fellowship Program. Dick Krasno knows Lewis Blair very well, and Lewis Blair had a conversation with Dick Neustadt back in 1991, and that he said, I want you to understand what Dick Neustadt thought the qualities of a president should be. And he had, as Bill George would, moral compass, he had 5 qualities: awareness of how you're doing, self-confidence, energy, and very importantly, Kennedy added humor. I mean, Neustadt added humor as an quality of someone who could be in that job. I've always felt that was an important part of sort of to go to Bill George's point about authenticity and knowing who you are, and then you can step back and have a sense of humor about life. Mm-hmm. But the question I have is to you now to follow up Rosabeth's point about losing teams and how you turn that around. And you made the intriguing suggestion that in order to bring people into a greater sense of collaboration and conversation, that we should draw upon in new ways, the new technologies that are available to us, and that perhaps someone could govern in a different way. This goes to the whole idea of a new politics. Are there ways that we could learn to communicate among each other and have conversations that would actually change the way people thought of citizenship and the way they saw themselves relating to civic engagement and to leaders? Could you, and I'd welcome others on the panel responding to that, because it does seem to me that is one of the potential breakthrough ideas that a new president could bring to the office.
Thanks, David, for giving me this opportunity, but also for mentioning humor, if I could just sidetrack for a second, because I ended my comment saying we need a spirit of action rather than apocalyptic thinking. I've been thinking recently that America has a gross national comedy deficit because so many things that were once jokes have actually come to pass. But humor is important not just because of that self-deprecating, don't take yourself too seriously quality in leaders, but also because comedy essentially is about the possibilities for change, as opposed to tragedy, which is you're stuck in something you couldn't change no matter what. So it's this idea of change, and the new technology is already engaging people in all kinds of dialogues. I mean, I go on the CNN website, and I'm fascinated to read all the comments people send in about these issues. You know, some short and sarcastic or nasty, but an awful lot that are very thoughtful. I mean, we have many ways to gather intelligence, gather information, take the pulse of the population, communicate information, give people depth who want depth, show people who else is thinking the way they're thinking.
we have tremendous opportunities to use these tools. And if it sounds like, you know, we couldn't possibly throw things open, Sam Palmisano, chairman of IBM, wanted to create a new statement of IBM values for the 21st century, because the first set of values had been laid down nearly 100 years ago by one person, Tom Watson. And so he created a 3-day conversation on the web in which all 350,000 employees could weigh in. And that was distilled. People commented on each other's comments, and the first day they were a little concerned because it felt out of control, because people were being negative. And then other people in the IBM world weighed in, countering the negative, saying, stop that, you know, it's up to you, you could make a difference. And by the second and third day, it was very positive. And out of that, they distilled 3 simple value statements of principles that are now guiding a global corporation everywhere in the world. And people actually refer to them constantly. And so we have talked a little bit about messaging on the part of a president, that you stand for some principles that people can understand and articulate. We could use the technology to engage people, to hear their views, to educate people, to connect people with each other who want to work on a particular issue. The young social entrepreneurs, actually social entrepreneurs are now going to be of every age if we have our way here at Harvard. Advanced leadership is a new initiative we're taking on. That's a way to help people understand what action they can take locally in collaboration with people throughout the country who have similar ideas. We could mobilize not only a conversation, we could mobilize action through using these tools. And as I said, they're already being used. They just haven't been embraced here as something we could do. And of course, we could also improve healthcare delivery dramatically if we had a national information system that physicians could use. We could empower teachers. There's already much evidence about that, by giving them access to best practices from other teachers. And we're behind some other countries in the world, including the UK, in terms of using electronic technology as a means of governing.
I'm going to let Bill George get one last. David, do you want to?
I want to make sure Andy Carr had a chance, because he's been.
Okay.
I appear on a panel at 1:15, I think, or 1:30 this afternoon. And I'd like to say someone deserves equal time. I'm not sure I'm worthy of the equal time. But in terms of looking for a vice president, I think David Gergen has it exactly right. A vice president should have the capacity to be the president. It's an understudy in a play for which there is no other understudy. And they have to be prepared to take the leading role. And their advice and counsel to the sitting president is entirely at the discretion of the sitting president. The vice president is a unique individual in that he's the only assigned responsibility in our Constitution that serves in Article 1 and in Article 2. So he straddles a fence, or that person would have to straddle a fence, and you know if you straddle a fence and the fence is too high, it hurts in the wrong place. But that's exactly the challenge that a vice president has. They have no formal role other than to be the president of the Senate and cast a tie-breaking vote, and to be available to be president should the call come. But beyond that, I would say the advice and counsel is something that a president should anticipate and invite, but it is not a requirement. And I don't believe that a president and a vice president have to like each other. I do think that they should have a level of communication that invites constructive results, but I am not one who thinks that we have to change the definition of a vice president in order to qualify what it means to be a good vice president.
Andy, what about communications with these new technologies?
With regard to communications, most of the laws in the United States that relate to the performance of the executive branch were written with an expectation of what communication was like 20 years ago, rather than the communications of zeros and ones today. And because the old laws aren't connected with the reality of the moment, enforcing the old laws creates challenges for a president or anybody who works in the executive branch. Since zeros and ones must be translated, which means they have to be stored and then regurgitated and then disseminated, they fall under a law that says if anything is stored in the White House, then it cannot be destroyed. And that's why you have emails that exist today when thoughts used to not be required to be saved if they were expressed verbally. But if they're expressed in zeros and ones, they must be saved. And that's caused a crisis in communication in the executive branch. And it means that zeros and ones, it's pretty amazing when you think about it. We thought we were pretty darn arrogant that we could take everything and translate it by using 26 letters in our alphabet. We presumed we could describe everything in the universe with our 26 letters. Now we know that we can translate everything with only 2 digits, or an on switch and an off switch. And that is a remarkable achievement because we almost can even describe emotions with zeros and ones by putting a colon and a parentheses. So I am troubled by the delay in our law from the reality of today and how it tempers the ability to communicate inside the executive branch. It has caused people to communicate and wish they could take the words back when you can know that the words may not be remembered, but it is almost impossible to take the zeros and ones back. And they are taken frequently out of context. So I do think the communication today is a terrible problem for the executive branch. And it prevents the president from getting the advice that we all know that the president should be able to get, which is unvarnished. And I find that we have tripped over ourselves with our ability to communicate. And the generation far younger than mine doesn't understand the problem because that's how they communicate. And by the way, the president, who was addicted, if you will, to email before he took office, was precluded from using it once he took office. So he is not connected to the world digitally, except vicariously through others on his staff.
Before I let Bill George get the last word, I'm going to use some good judgment and not get in the way of this crowd and lunch. And ask Bill just to share the last comment, and then we'll thank the panel, and we've got to make sure we respect the time this afternoon of the other group. But go ahead, Bill.
I think Andy was pointing out a very interesting dichotomy in our society about communications, but I think the other half of that is, picking up your question, David, really is engagement. And I think the new president must really engage the populace where they live. Today's young people and old people as well, very engaged in social networking and communicating in new ways. And although I agree fully with Larry Summers' statement that it'd be great if the next president has a strong mandate on values, I totally disagree with the idea that we shouldn't devolve down to a series of town hall forums. I actually think we should. I actually think we should engage people because the kind of problems they're dealing with now, the great 5 problems that I mentioned earlier, are so intractable that we need engagement of the citizenry. They cannot all be solved at the very top. The president has to engage us in solving those problems. It's the only way they can be solved, and I think that sense of engagement and getting people involved. And people love to blog and offer their opinions. Okay, now let's ask them actually to do something. One of the best ideas I've heard come along is let's give, instead of mandatory national service, let's give everyone a $4,000 college credit if they'll engage in public service and broaden national service into public service. That's a way of engaging the citizenry. But I think a lot of people would like to do that. And if we can have a leader who will engage them, I think we'll see a much more empowered populace that can come together and help us solve some of these intractable problems we have in the world.
Okay, let me just give you a logistics direction, which will be important to some people. Those who would like lunch, the Regatta Bar is to the left, and once we break, we'll have a buffet lunch there, and we are back here at 1:20. let me end by thanking the panel for contributing to this conversation, and we're on a lunch break. Thank you very much.
Andy, till Georgia.